So how can we now store that date that was selected? Well, showDatePicker in the end returns that picked date, but wrapped into a so-called future, a value of type future, which we haven't encountered thus far. Now, futures are a very important data type built into Dart. You will see futures again later in the course when we work with HTTP requests, and a future simply is an object from the future, you could say. It simply is an object that wraps a value which you don't have yet, but which you will have in the future. Like here for showDatePicker. When this line of code is executed by Flutter, it opens this date picker and shows it on the screen. But of course, no date has been picked yet. That will only happen in the future, you could say. Therefore, Flutter internally basically memorizes that in the future some value will be picked here, and it allows you to register a function that should be executed in that future once that value is available. And that function can be registered by calling a method on that object, on that future object that is returned by showDatePicker. So this future object, and that's important to understand, is returned immediately, but it doesn't contain the picked value yet. Instead, this future object gives you a then method, which you can call, to which you can pass a function, an anonymous function for example, which then will get that value, which in this case here has been picked, once it has been picked. So this function which you pass to then will be executed by Flutter once the value is available. So once a date has been picked here. It's kind of similar to how buttons work, where we also defined a function that will be executed in the future, but here we're dealing with a widget where we set this function as a value for one of the many widget arguments. In case of showDatePicker, we instead get such a future object to which we pass such a function. But the idea is generally the same, that we want to get hold of some value or some event in the future. Now, using such a then method is one way of getting hold of that value. A more convenient method is to add the special async keyword here between the parentheses after the method name before the opening curly brace, and then add the await keyword in front of the code that does yield such a future. So you can't use async await here in the build method for your widgets, but you can use it whenever you get such a future value. If you use await here, you get access to that picked date in this case here as a value in a regular variable. But even though this now looks like all the other code, or almost like all the other code, the await keyword internally simply tells Flutter that this value that should be stored in picked date won't be available immediately, but at least at some point in the future, and Flutter should therefore basically wait for that value before it stores it in that variable. Nonetheless, Flutter will make sure that the next line after this code here, so this line here, will only be executed once the value is available. So it will really kind of wait for that value. And therefore here we could print that picked date. Or we could store it in a variable, possibly even with setState, so that we could output it here in this text next to this icon button. And that is indeed what I want to do here. So I'll add a new variable here, underscore selected date, which should be of type datetime. And since I am setting a type here, the var keyword must be omitted. And actually, it initially will not hold a value, hence it should be datetime ? To tell Flutter that selected date either stores a value of type datetime or nothing, null, as it's called in Dart. And instead of %datePicker, here, after waiting for the selected date, we can call setState and set selected date equal to the picked date. And picked date is of type datetime, so setting it like this is fine. And with that, we can use this selected date to output it down there. Of course, here I again want to output a version that's human readable. And for that reason, I'll use the same approach I used before in my expense model, where I use this Intel package and such a formatter by adding it here to this new expense start file as well. And this formatter can be set up outside of any class. Alternatively, we could of course also simply import from our own package here. So from our own project package, and there from the expense start file in the models folder, because in there we set up this formatter, so it is actually available as soon as we import from this file. And we can use this formatter down there to not output selected date here, but instead I want to output no date selected if we haven't selected a date yet. So I want to check if underscore selected date is equal to null. And then we can use a ternary expression here to output no date selected in that case. Or alternatively, we can use the formatter here and call format on the selected date to output a formatted version of that date. And now we have to remove the const keyword here. Now I'm getting an error here that in the end date time might be null here, and format wants a date time that can't be null. There is no question mark after date time here. Of course, we know that selected date won't be null here though, because we're checking this here, and therefore we can add an exclamation mark at the end to basically force Dart to assume that this won't be null. So with an exclamation mark after a possibly null value, we tell Dart that this will never be null, which we know with certainty here because we're checking for null equality here. So with that, with all of that out of the way, we can save this. And if we go back to our application and we pick a date here, we can see that formatted picked date here. And of course, we can also change that date and it would update here. So that's now working as it should. And we can therefore now, as a next step, work on that category selection dropdown.